Through this week-long Lunch and Learn webinar series that we're providing, we hope to provide education, direction, and resources on best harm reduction practices and supports in Central Alberta, as well as greater insights on how to support healthier, safer communities for all. This is our second Lunch and Learn, and our topic today is drug trends and stigma. This webinar will be roughly 20 to 25 minutes long, followed by a question period. So throughout this entire presentation, please feel free to ask your questions in the Q&A chat box, and our presenters will try and answer them at the end. Today, you'll be hearing from Kevin Cunningham and Jen McCrindle, who are operating our rural outreach programs in Central Alberta. I guess without any further ado, I'll pass it on to, I think, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody. My name's Kevin Cunningham. I've been working with Turning Point for well over 3 years now. So the first slide shows here our vision, and respect and dignity for all in a safe and healthy community is Turning Point's vision. I'll run through the programs and services briefly, and we'll move on from there. So our largest program is our harm reduction program. And that's well over 200 unique individuals accessing substance use equipment, sterile substance use equipment. They're able to dispose of used materials there, also connect with first aid and wound care, see a nurse at our office, and also to safer sex supplies can be accessed through harm reduction program. The roots of our agency started out in 1988 as a community-based response to the HIV epidemic that was happening then. So since then, back then we were called Central Alberta AIDS Network Society, and our programs and services have evolved since then and have shifted focus. In the mid-90s, we started distributing harm reduction supplies, syringe access programs, and needle exchange. And that was a response to the HIV epidemic and the priorities shifting. And our harm reduction workers also look after over 25 needle disposal containers throughout the city, or drop boxes. You may see them in the parks and trail systems or throughout the downtown core. The next program I'll mention is our women's program, and that's staffed by a nurse and an outreach worker who work with women, street-involved women and girls to help address substance use, poverty, domestic violence, and the focus is on sexual and reproductive health. The next program I'll mention is rural outreach, and that's Jen McCrindle and myself who work in the whole Alberta Health Services Central Zone of Alberta, which is a massive area. It's almost a population of 500,000, and it stretches all the way up to Drayton Valley, as far south as Didsbury. We go as far west as Rocky Mountain House, Sunchild, Ochese, and then it goes all the way out east to the Saskatchewan border, which includes towns like Stettler, Consort, Coronation. So it's a massive zone that Jen and I cover. The next program I'll mention is health promotion, and that's supports for people living with HIV, hepatitis C, and other STDs. And that works to help remove barriers and keep people connected to healthcare. Night Reach is our program that is staffed by 2 outreach workers each evening, and they are out there working 365 evenings per year, whether it's -30, -40, they're out there. Hot, same thing, +30, +40, they're out there every evening, connecting people to health and social services, walking people to the shelter if they need to be walked there, doing things like first aid and wound care, providing harm reduction supplies. And Night Reach is a really fun program to be a part of, as they all are. Overdose prevention is our take-home naloxone program, and it's staffed by registered nurse Trisha and myself. And we go into communities and teach people how to recognize an opioid overdose. We talk about current drug trends, what we're seeing, and then how to respond using naloxone. An extension of that program, or a different program altogether, is our overdose prevention site, which is in the downtown core of Red Deer in the parking lot of Safe Harbor. Giving Back is another program or initiative in which clients are able to come and work with us for a couple hours per day and go out into the community and tidy up needle debris. So we're out there walking the downtown streets, parks and trail systems, looking for any needle debris and tidying it up. CAMO is a newer program, and it stands for Central Alberta Men's Outreach, and that's all things sexual health. And it's such a great program. And yeah, if please ask any questions about any of our programs and services as the presentation wraps up. Next slide.
Thanks, Kevin. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Jen McCrindle, and I will be talking a little bit about what we are seeing in the Central Zone as far as drug trends and transitioning into stigma and how we can combat the stigma around drug use. We chose to focus this presentation on the area that we serve during doing rural outreach rather than provincial. Our area encompasses about 94,000 kilometers west from Rocky Mountain House, east to the Saskatchewan border. We travel as far as north as Camrose and south to Drumheller. It is a combination of many small, often farming communities and one urban center being Red Deer, with a relatively low population of 450,000. What we are experiencing in the Central Zone is quite similar with the rest of the province as far as drug toxicity and overdose deaths. In turn, Alberta mirrors what is happening across Canada, especially since the beginning of the pandemic. When I'm mentioning the following numbers and percentages in this section, I absolutely reflect on the fact and grieve that these are real people. Every person represented by a number is loved by someone. They are family members, friends, co-workers. The longtime friends that I have personally lost in the last year were dedicated fathers, had a strong work ethic, were lighthearted, funny, and kind. Unfortunately, they were also part of the demographic and are among a sea of young people affected by an ongoing drug poisoning crisis, now compounded by COVID-19. Central Zone had 74 deaths in 2019. That has dramatically increased in 2020 to 128 people. Just a couple months into 2021, and there have been 25 people lost to drug poisoning. Data is approximately 1 month behind, so that number is certainly higher. At this rate, we are losing someone every 3 days to a preventable cause. Opioids were present in 116 of these cases, with 75% specifically involving fentanyl. Also noteworthy is the presence of methamphetamine in fatalities. Meth contributed to 60 deaths last year, which is another jump from 36 in 2019. Polysubstance use is common, and we can infer that much of the stimulant supply is cut with fentanyl analogs, increasing the risk of overdose. There was approximately 1,700 substance-related ER visits in the Central Zone in 2020, with about 900 hospitalizations. Although there was a slight increase of EMS responses to opiates at the beginning of the pandemic in April, that number has returned to its average level since the fall. The only OPS in the zone, which is operated by Turning Point in the city of Red Deer, helps to reduce calls for emergency services or hospital visits. Last year alone, the OPS reversed 1,190 overdoses that could have happened in the community or in people's homes. It is a valuable service that unquestionably saves lives. As far as access to opioid replacement treatments in our zone, methadone patients have remained relatively unchanged at approximately 250 people on programs. There has been an increase of people on Suboxone, which is now between 500 and 600 people accessing that form of treatment. Overall in Alberta, the people most affected by this crisis are predominantly men at 76% in the age range of 25 to 45 years. The highest rate is among males 35 to 39 years old. This is not to, there is also a large number of families and other people that cared about the people that we've lost. This is an entire generation at risk, and young, otherwise healthy people should not be dying at this rate from preventable deaths. Next slide, please.
Okay, so in the theme of current drug trends, I'm going to go through some substances that were sent into BC for analysis from the Central Zone of Alberta. So all samples are mailed through the mail to getyourdrugstested.com, which please check out. It's available to anyone. And the service is free of charge. It's anonymous. It takes about a week to 2 weeks for the results. And the sample size needed is about the size of a head of a match. So that can be, they ask that the samples are triple bagged, put in an envelope, and then sent to the downtown east side in Vancouver, where they're analyzed using a FTIR mass spectrometer and a few different test strips to test each sample. So the first sample I'll mention was analyzed on January 29th in 2021, and it was purchased as down. And if you hear me saying down, that's an umbrella or catch-all term for heroin or fentanyl or opioids. And so this sample of down tested as caffeine with mannitol at 30 to 35%. The caffeine, we all know what caffeine is, but mannitol is a sugar alcohol sweetener and can be used as an eye/cranial pressure medication. Then there was some fentanyl found in the substance at 10 to 15%, which is very common. And there was no benzodiazepine detected in this substance. However, they sent back a message with caution because there are benzo-like substances such as atezolam showing up with greater regularity, and they don't activate the benzodiazepine test strip. So caution was expressed with that sample. The next sample I'll mention was sent in December 12th, 2020. The sample was purchased as carfentanil, and it was supposed to be uncut carfentanil, and it tested as dimethylsulfone at 50%, which is an anti-inflammatory dietary supplement. So half of it was that supplement. The next thing that turned up in this substance was phenacetin, which is a pain relieving and fever reducing drug withdrawn from medical use in the 70s because it was deemed dangerous for human consumption. So that was a little bit alarming that 25% of the substance was this phenacetin. There was about 25% caffeine, and they were unable to detect any fentanyl or carfentanil on the machine, but the fentanyl test strip came back positive. So there was some fentanyl in this sample. There was no benzodiazepines tested in that substance. The next sample I'll mention is a green fentanyl that was purchased on the streets, and it came back tested as erythritol, which is a sugar substitute at about 60%. Caffeine came in at 15%, fentanyl at 20 to 25%, and no benzodiazepines in that sample, according to the test strip. Then there was some purple fentanyl that was tested at the same time. And this one was quite alarming because it came back at about 50 to 55% fentanyl, which a normal, it's usually around 5 to 10%. So this one was incredibly strong. And they said, please, please, please be careful with this one. So that was about 50, 55% fentanyl, 30% caffeine, 15% mannitol, and there was benzodiazepines in this sample. So some of the problems we see with benzodiazepines being in some down samples is if someone is experiencing overdose symptoms and not breathing, and we revive them or interrupt the overdose using naloxone, if there's a high enough benzodiazepine content in the substance, some people will remain unresponsive or really drowsy, sometimes sleepy for hours after we reverse the overdose, or it could be, I've heard even a day or two with heavy benzodiazepines in the substance. Next slide. So it's safe to say now that we're seeing all classification of drugs are at risk of containing fentanyl, not just down. So substances like methamphetamine, MDMA, and cocaine. And why might this be happening? I get asked the question a lot, why would someone put fentanyl in a bag of MDMA or cocaine, for instance? And not to say that it doesn't happen. I don't think people are doing this purposefully most of the time. I think it could be as simple, just speculating here, of dealers being a little bit sloppy and selling multiple substances at once and say weighing up their fentanyl on a scale, not cleaning the fentanyl off and then weighing up some cocaine after. Or similarly, like you see the bags on the slide here, maybe someone used up a bag with fentanyl in it and there's a little bit left in the corner and then they bag up their cocaine. So that could be how it happens. And it just takes such a small amount of fentanyl to cause a poisoning for somebody who has such a low tolerance and isn't expecting to consume fentanyl. So this messaging is kind of directed towards the more recreational or celebratory person who uses substances and not expecting to have some fentanyl in there. Next slide. We're also seeing meth use increase over the past decade, kind of taking the place of crack cocaine. Not saying that crack cocaine isn't out there, it's just meth use is being used quite a bit more. And some of the reasons why, when speculating about that too, is it's quite a bit more inexpensive compared to crack cocaine, sometimes half the price. Methamphetamine can release 4 times as much dopamine as cocaine. It lasts much longer, and Border Patrol agents report seizing 10 to 20 times more meth today than a decade ago. So we are seeing quite a bit more meth use, and sometimes, like Jen mentioned, polysubstance use, where people are using multiple different substances at once. Next slide. So long as drugs are criminalized, stigmatized, and illegal to use, the black market will continue manufacturing stronger, cheaper, and more dangerous versions of these desired substances, putting people who use drugs at greater risk for negative health outcomes and death. We're kind of seeing this repeated. And if we look back to the prohibition days of alcohol, many people, when alcohol was prohibited, might have preferred to drink a glass of wine or have a beer. But what was happening in the Al Capone days is people were bootlegging moonshine. And why is that? Is because it's more lucrative. And if I'm going to bootleg and I load my trunk full of alcohol, I'm probably going to want to use the strongest stuff possible to make it worth my while. And we're seeing the same thing now with fentanyl and carfentanil getting stronger and stronger. Previously, when someone might import a pallet full of heroin, can now import a sunglass case of fentanyl and make a lot of money off that small amount. So personally, I wish we could go back to the days when OxyContin and morphine were the pervasive opioids out there. And that's where my lived experience comes from, was back in the early 2000s, before fentanyl and green beans and all these newer forms of opioids, stronger forms came out. I wish we could go back to those days of oxys and morphine, because I never once saw an overdose personally. I never had a friend die of overdose when I was out there. And that's because we knew the purity. Each pill we got came from a pharmacy. We knew how to dose properly. Yeah, that just speaks to how inconsistent and unpredictable the drugs are out there today. Next slide.
Thanks for that, Kevin. I came across a study when doing research for this, and it was from 2007, where 1,000 illicit drug users were interviewed. And I just thought it was noteworthy to talk about how people who use drugs perceive stigma. In this study, 74% of participants believe that people look down on them because of their drug use. 77% of people believe they were not a good person because they used drugs. 75% of people say their family rejected them because of their drug use. And 33% said they were able to obtain housing because of their drug use. I think that's astounding that 3 out of 4 people, although maybe they can't always name stigma, they perceive it and are harmed by all kinds of things. But today I'd like to talk a little bit about language and things that we can do to change the language we use when talking about drug use. The language we use has a direct and profound impact on those around us, and it is important to acknowledge that it does. The negative impacts of stigma can be reduced by changing how we talk about substance use, by altering our words to be more respectful and compassionate. The following are examples of how seemingly small changes we all can practice making can lead to a broader societal shift when discussing this issue. Firstly, use neutral, medically accurate terminology. If the topic is people who are using drugs, avoid using words like addicts, junkies, meth heads, crackheads, or drug abusers. Instead, practice saying people who use drugs, a person with substance use disorder, or having lived or living experience. Using this people first language puts focus on the individual, not their actions or behaviors. No matter how long someone may be in recovery, please do not refer to them as a former drug addict or as clean, or the phrase clean and sober. The suggestion that someone is clean if they are not using implies that they are dirty or unkept when they are in active use. Instead, say people with lived experience or simply someone in recovery. The terms clean and dirty could also be applied to the language of workplace or other institutional drug testing. Just say positive for substance or negative for substance. We have to stop stigmatizing different forms of recovery by implying that OAT, which is Suboxone or methadone treatments, replace one drug for another. We have to recognize that each person has a different path to recovery, and positive changes should be celebrated, not judged. For service providers, using terminology such as non-compliant or difficult may be labeling what is likely someone's inability to meet high barriers. Next slide, please, Mitch. Okay, so how can I support others if I am a non-drug user? And what are some solutions to combat the stigma? Firstly, don't assume all use is chaotic. Drug use occurs on a continuum from experimental, recreational, and celebratory to problematic and harmful to self or others. It is most often found somewhere in the middle. Understand that everyone's goal is not always total abstinence. Periods of abstinence or modified use should be treated as successes rather than failures or not meeting other people's expectations of recovery. Any positive change that improves the health or quality of life of people using drugs is significant. Be mindful of comments and conversations online. This is an issue that everyone has been impacted by in some way. People who use drugs see these comments from their community, and it keeps them wanting to remain hidden, using alone, and afraid to access supports. Remind yourself and gently to others that drug users are people with families and friends and are loved. They have unique traits, talents, and skills, and it can happen to any one of us. It is not us versus them, they are us. Listen without judgment. It is easy to suggest, but can be challenging to put into practice. Do not disclose conversations with other people unless it is absolutely necessary to do so. Continually check your biases and question content of familiar stereotypes through media, film, TV shows. Learn to recognize an overdose and how to respond with naloxone. Carry it proudly in your vehicle or in your bag and normalize talking about it. This may not sound extreme for some, but if you do have someone in your life who you love that you know or suspect is using alone, offer to spot them over the phone as a means of supervised consumption. This is an act of radical love in a time when the illicit drug supply is highly toxic, unregulated, and unpredictable. We do not have access to SCS or OPS aside from Red Deer in the entire Central Zone. With the recent rollout of the Peer Volunteered National Overdose Response Line, or NORS, they have offered a hopeful option, but it is only accessible if people have cell phones or service to use the app. Finally, get involved, however that looks within your capacity and in your community. Plan to attend or organize events, memorials, and opportunities for discussion. Join membership for advocacy groups that align with the principles of harm reduction. Some groups can include Moms Stop the Harm, who have a wonderful virtual memorial that can be viewed right now. Change the Face of Addiction and Aware, that's Alberta addicts who educate and advocate responsibly, are some examples of groups that are challenging the stigma and sharing personal stories to help change the narrative. If you are in the business community and wonder how you can show support for harm reduction, consider looking into initiatives such as eachandevery.org. This group supports and encourages businesses to help end the stigma surrounding drug use through collective action and targeted campaigns to accelerate drug policy reform. I realize that Stigma is a lot to unpack. We could talk about this easily for hours, but we really tried to compile what we thought was relevant information for the Central Zone, and hope that it was helpful, and we're happy to take any questions that you have.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin and Jen, there for sharing your insights on current drug trends and stigma. It's quite a heavily loaded topic, so thank you for helping us with that. There's no questions right now in the Q&A box. There was a few that popped up in our chat here, but I can give a few seconds here for people to write questions there if they would like to or have any. Oh, here's one right here. Can you explain a little more about camo? I can do that. Yeah, I am actually one of the peer workers for the CAMO program. So that again is a Central Alberta Men's Outreach, and that is just a peer outreach program for queer specific men in Central Alberta. So that could be anything from gay, bi, trans, questioning, two-spirited, and non-binary men. And that's with a focus on health. So that could be getting access to condoms and safe sex supplies, or getting referrals to testing and treatment within the Central Zone and the Alberta area. So it's quite a bit there, and it's additionally to that, it's also supporting men with different parts of the queer community. So it's just making sure that they have the resources available for their full well-being. So that's a little bit about what that's for. And if you would like to know more about that, there's more on our website under CAMO. And I recently just put up a post on our Facebook page for that as well. Another question we have here is, could you please send the links and resources you just mentioned? Yeah, we can definitely do that as well. Give me a second and I can try and get those to you. Another question, does your women's outreach programs cater to individuals who are not currently pregnant? I'll let one of you guys take that on there.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, a woman doesn't have to be pregnant to access the program. And yeah, it's open to all women. Yeah, for sure.
Okay, another one. Can you speak about, I'm not sure how to pronounce it properly, fluelprazolam, and whether it is one of the benzos showing up in the drug samples?
How is it spelled?
FLUALPRAZOLAM.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one. Is that a benzo-like substance? Or what is the question?
The question is, can you speak about fluelprazolam and whether it is one of the benzos showing up in the drug samples?
I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that benzo specifically turn up, but yeah, there's all sorts of different benzos showing up in the samples, but that one specifically, I haven't seen in any of the samples we've sent through. And if you're curious more about drug testing and what's showing up, if you go to getyourdrugstested.com, they have a log of every sample they've tested since they started. And it's pages and pages and pages and pages of samples sent from around Western Canada. So I'm willing to bet you'll probably see that type of benzo in some of the samples for sure.
All right, I have another comment here. Any opinions on a move towards legalizing a clean drug supply?
Absolutely. It's desperately needed to stabilize people so that they can move into a place of recovery if that's what they choose. The health outcomes from people that are on a certain safe supply program, it's really hard to argue with them. People have maintained their housing. People have gone back to working and being employed. They've rebuilt relationships with their families. There's far too much evidence, in my eyes, that we need to do it, and we need to do it now. We cannot wait for the death rates to keep climbing